I'm going to try to do this from here. Is this going to work? You going to be all right? I've never given a talk in a church before. I'm nervous. I don't know about you. The last time I was on an altar was 35 years ago, and I lit my hair on fire. I was an altar boy, and we'd just gotten done with communion, and I was holding the plate, so in case you drop it. And only in one part of the season, they'll put a candle right here, the Pascal candle, I think it's called. It's not there all the time, but it's there on this Sunday, and I just turn around and go, and my whole head goes up in flames, which does not smell good in a closed church, just so you know. I live in Tunbridge, Vermont. My wife and I have lived in Vermont for 16 of the 22 years that we've been together. My daughter is the only true Vermonter in our house. She was born in Burlington when we were in grad school. So Scott, if you, on the next slide, you'll see that's my backyard. That's it looks like this place pretty much. But if you go next slide, that's what it looks like most of the time. Okay, so just need to know that. That's a snow fence. I have to build a 50-foot snow fence every winter. I have to put it up. It runs parallel with my driveway and keeps the snow drifts behind the fence and off my driveway. A snow fence is not a bad metaphor for regulation. That is, I study emotion, but mostly what I study is how well you regulate your emotions, or not so. And your emotional life, the things that life throws at you are often not under your control, like the weather. I can't control the weather, but I can have a strategy in the winter for being able to get my work done, being able to get down my driveway. And in this form, it's a 50-foot snow fence. And so part of what we'll talk about tonight are the 50-foot snow fences that you have to construct and to help you navigate the things that life throws at you, because they're not always going to be under your control. All that said, I also specialize in anxiety and anxiety disorders. That's what I study. We have a saying in research is me search. That can be true. So it's possible that I study anxiety because it's something I deal with. But you can also, it's also true in our field that you either study what you have, which might be the case with anxiety and me, or you study what you lack. So I have another friend who studies emotion, but that's because he's never had one and he's wondering what's going on over there. Okay? All right, so on the next slide, I don't even know what's coming. Oh, so that's my lab. Everybody on the left is in my current lab. They do all the work. They're all getting their, Justin and Annie and James and Allie are getting their PhDs. Yuchen has her PhD. And Amy and Caroline and Maytel and Huck Jin, those are the kids that I've graduated, and they're out doing their own science now. Next slide. So this is the area of the brain that I study. It's called the amygdala. It is relatively small. If we look at the next slide, you can see that I care so much about this that you're not allowed to come to my website and visit me unless you can find the amygdala, okay, and click it. That's how you get into the website. So hopefully by the end of tonight, you'll know how to get into my website, okay? So look at the next slide and see that, you know, I get asked a lot, how, you know, is it possible to create an entire career studying this one little tiny part of the brain and ignoring pretty much everything else? And you'll see on the next slide that, yes, it's very possible, okay? It works really well sometimes, okay? So this is about, now you know my bias, right? Now you know I have two questions for the brain. What does amygdala do for you, or what do you do for amygdala, okay? That's really all I've got. And luckily for me, when you study anxiety, this ends up being a big player, a big circuitry that's involved in when you feel anxious, when you're doing things like breathing deeply to try to feel less anxious. Amygdala is going to be a big part of the story, so that's some of what we'll talk about tonight. So next slide, where are we going? I just let you know that I started with animal research. Okay, I started studying the amygdalas of rabbits, and about 5 years into my PhD, I realized I was terrified of rabbits, so I had to do something different with my degree once I got it. So I got it and didn't want to work with bunnies anymore, so that's when I jumped to Mass General and started working with you. you know, you can think maybe you're smarter than the rabbits, but I'll tell you this, they're much more punctual than you are, okay? A rabbit has never called me from the highway to say they're going to be 15 minutes late for my experiment, okay? It's never happened. Okay, so on the next slide, you see this is what we use now. That's a magnetic resonance imager. It's just a magnet. And we put you on the bed, and then we push the bed into the bore. So in some way, miraculously, just by putting you inside a magnet, we can see inside your body. We don't have to inject you with anything. There's no radiation involved. Okay, if you look to the next slide. There's lots of ways to image you, right? But some are safer than others. X-rays are not safe. We're actually passing radiation through your body. You know that. You can't have an X-ray every day. But you can get in my brain scanner every day. So we'll go to the next slide. And then the slide after that. And this is what the images look like, right? So that's a brain facing this direction, sliced right down the middle. And they're pretty. And what it is how many people have been in an MRI? Do you have fun in there? No. Yeah. Most people describe it as either a neutral or negative situation. It's pretty tight in there. Your physical size actually depends a lot on how comfortable you're going to be. We run a lot of studies with children. We thought they were going to have more trouble than you in there. They have a lot of room in there. For them, it's like a fort. All right? They think it's great. Most people don't think it's great. Most people don't love being in there. But, you know, you close your eyes, you pretend the pillow is the pillow in your bed, you breathe deeply, and that feeling passes, and most people can get through it. Our studies take about 45 minutes. So you're in there for a while, looking at whatever pictures we're going to show you. So we'll go to the next slide. I'm giving you this term limbic system because I know you've heard it, right? And you could probably tell me the limbic system is a collection of brain areas that have something to do with processing emotion. And that's what they do. So amygdala is in there, and hippocampus, and hypothalamus, and cingulate. It's not really important. What's important is that these things are buried deep in your brain, right? So the spinal cord's coming up, and then like a fist, you have these central areas of the brain. And then if we look at the next slide, you know, you have this cortex on top of it, and this wrinkled cortex that makes you so impressively intelligent. But the way I want you to think about it tonight is when your cortex is doing something, you're aware of it. You can talk to me about it. I'm seeing a talk right now. I can hear the speaker, his words, and I can understand what he's saying. If you can talk to yourself about what's happening to you, then it's probably mostly your cortex at work. But that limbic system, those areas down below, they're doing stuff every second of the day, and you're not necessarily going to be privy to what they're working on. So if we advance the slide, I want to, okay, we'll go ahead, another one. Yeah, I want to introduce you to this guy. This fellow, the left side of his face is paralyzed. He can't move it. He's been asked to smile. He's trying to turn up both corners of his mouth, but he can't. He can't move the left side of his face. Now, you might know then that you have a motor strip. You know that the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. You know that. So then that means he must have a lesion somewhere over here, and that's why he can't move the muscles of his face when you ask him to. But if one of you cracks a hilarious joke, you can see he's cured. He can move those muscles fine. What does that tell you? It tells you have two motor systems. You have a cortical motor system that when you try to do things voluntarily, that's at work. But there's another part of your brain that goes to all your muscles, and it can move them around too. But it's much more implicit is the word we use. It's much more automatic. When somebody cracks a joke, you don't get to decide if it's funny or not. It either is or isn't to you, right? You can, if you're in church, oh, that's a bad example. If I'm in church with my mother, and my brother Scott is standing next to me, whispering in my ear, trying to get me to crack up, you know, I can't determine what's funny and what's not, and by the way, he's not. But if my mother's got my ear in this hand, I can squelch my reactions. But the automatic reaction is there, okay? And so if we go to the next slide, that area of your brain, that's your automatic motor area. It's called the striatum. It sits right smack in the middle of your head, okay? This is where anything that you've practiced, any motor behavior that you've practiced, it lives here now. And you don't even have to think about it anymore, right? So that, you know, riding a bike is a classic example. But I don't think any of you rode a bike to get here tonight, did you? No. How'd you get here? You drove, right? Think about how you drove over here tonight. And think about how you drove during your driving test when you were 16, right? One was very cortical. very effortful. And then the more you learned it, the more you practiced it, you actually transfer that knowledge to the striatum. Now your striatum drives, right? And then on a long drive, like the one I just took, every now and then, right, you come back. Who's been driving the car for the last 9.5 minutes, right? And you have this vague recollection of a left and a right, but you weren't doing it explicitly. Your striatum was doing it implicitly, okay? You're very good at this. So you want to leave these automatic areas to their own devices because they're really good at what they do. Striatum knows how to drive really well. If I put a cop in your rearview mirror, suddenly driving is very effortful, right? Do you see what you're doing? You're trying to help. You're bringing your cortex back online and trying to drive better. But your cortex hasn't driven for quite some time, okay? It's terrible at it, actually. So you want to leave these automatic areas alone. So if we go to the next slide, I just gave you a motor example, that you have an automatic motor system, and that's the striatum. I'm going to use that as an analogy now because this talk's not about motor behavior, it's about emotion. And what I'm going to suggest to you is amygdala is one of those implicit brain areas that has a very important job, but it doesn't really involve you in the conversation, okay? What does amygdala do for a living? Amygdala tries to detect something, anything, that could have predicted for you that you were about to get into trouble, that you were going to experience pain, okay? So we call them conditioned stimuli, right? If you remember from Psych 1, Pavlovian conditioning, you have an unconditioned stimulus, something that impacts your body and you don't have to learn about it, like pain. Okay, I don't have to teach you about pain. I don't have to teach you not to like pain. You don't like pain. And if I simply play a tone before I cause pain to you, amygdala is going to really know about that tone because it's predicting for you every time we hear this tone we get shocked or we feel some pain. Okay, so that's an experiment you would do to learn what amygdala does. But for you, anything that predicts an outcome for you, this system's going to learn about. So the amygdala sometimes gets called the fight or flight area of your brain. It is not. Whether you're going to fight or flee, that's a very complicated decision. And amygdala is not that bright. You have a cortex for that. Okay? What amygdala is doing, if there's a bear 2 inches from your face, there's not much amygdala can do for you. Better yesterday if you had learned what rustling of the bushes might mean and taken some evasive action, and then today a bear might not be 2 inches from our face. That's what amygdala is trying to do for you. Okay? So that's the system we're working with. We go to the next slide. Next one. So now we can go through these slides pretty quickly. The brain's faced this way. I'm just going to slice it here and then turn the brain towards you. There it is. So now you see you have two amygdala, right? It's a bilateral structure. There's two of them. Anyone know what the word means? It's Greek. I have a can of amygdalas sitting on my desk that someone brought me from Greece. If you see the next slide, it's almond. It means almond, right? So if we go to the next slide, things in the brain, these anatomists ran around, they either named them for what they're shaped as, in this case, or after themselves, like Broca's area, right? So we go to the next slide, and so I'm just showing you another view of left amygdala, brain facing this way. You can't see the right amygdala because the prefrontal cortex, that massive amount of cortex in the front here that makes you human, that's including your ability to see the right amygdala here. All right, so let's go ahead. I had to think about, I was doing tones and shocks with the rabbits, and I went to humans, and I could have done tones and shocks. I could have put you in a brain scanner, played a tone and shocked you, or stuck a pin in your foot just for fun, okay? And then do that 5 times, and then every time you hear the tone, then your amygdala is not going to like that. It's going to really know what that tone means. But I didn't have to do that with you because I've already got something that you already use, that already predicts outcomes for you, and that's each other's faces. You love each other's faces. And if we use faces, then we can look at emotional expression on the next slide. And so that face on the left, when you've seen that in the past, it has predicted outcomes from you that are very different than the face on the right and what that has predicted. Okay? And if we go to the next slide, we see that this is not necessarily uniquely human, right? I've named him Popeye. I love him. If we go to the next slide and then the next one, I'll just make it clear. Animals use the faces of other animals to predict what's going to happen next. So we're not the only ones that do this. You grab a bunch of sheep and you measure their little heart rates, and you show them that sheep on the right, and their little hearts go, in response to that. So we go to the next slide. The important point to make here is we call these the primary emotions or the basic facial expressions. And what we mean when we say that as psychologists is we think they're universal. That is, if you go anywhere in the world and ask for fear, you get something that looks like that. It crosses cultures. If you go anywhere in the world and ask for happy, you get something that looks like that. And you can see on the next slide, you never see an exception to this rule, ever. Just doesn't happen. Sorry. Now, on the next slide, you'll see this is the slide I use when I give talks in Texas, okay? Don't use the George Bush slide in Texas. You can carry a concealed weapon legally in Texas, okay? All right. Just fooling around. Okay, what do we got coming next? So, let me see the next slide? Yeah. So, this is what we decided to do. If amygdala is an area of the brain that has learned in your lifetime about important predictors of when bad things happen. And by the way, amygdala can do positivity, but its job is negativity. It's trying to keep you out of danger. And so we just said to ourselves, if we take a bunch of people like you and throw them in a brain scanner and show them a bunch of afraid faces, and then show them a bunch of males and females, all different pictures, and a bunch of happy faces, whatever amount of activity was going on in the amygdala when the happy faces came on would suddenly increase when the fear faces come on. And I think if we go to the next slide, that's what that picture is. And you can see now the amygdala has a yellow and red color on it, and that's what we call a brain activation. What we're actually measuring, I don't know if you know this, what MRI measures when you're doing functional brain scanning? It actually measures oxygen usage, right? Oxygen extraction. So there's oxygen in blood flowing all around the neurons, and if a small group of neurons becomes active, then they literally sucks more oxygen out of that local blood supply right there than any of the other brain areas in comparison. So that's really what you're measuring. You're measuring oxygen usage. It's a proxy for the fact that the neurons probably just increased their activity, and they did, but we don't actually measure that. So this works. And I'm off to a good start. I want to study the amygdala. I want to have a task that can activate the amygdala. I want the task to be simple. And you can't get any simpler than just letting you passively view faces and getting this brain activation. If I think that what's gone wrong in anxiety disorders is that you have an amygdala that is too often deciding that this might predict threat, too often searching for threat when it might not even exist, then you would expect exaggerated responses to these expressions in anxiety disordered patients. And we'll see some of that later, but that's exactly what happens. On the next slide, what I want to show you is, see, I want this to be implicit. And that last slide didn't prove that yet, because here's another way you're different than rabbits when you're in my studies and you're my subjects. You try to figure out the experiment when you're in it. Do you know what I mean? You're kind of annoying that way, okay? Because I didn't ask you to, but you come out of my brain scan and you go, I know what you're doing. You show me negative faces and positive faces and blah, 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 blah. And even though I'm very proud of you that you're correct, you're ruining everything, because I want this to be implicit, and there you are explicitly talking to me about my faces. And now, the problem with brain activations is you don't know if it's the brain area talking to another brain area or some other area talking to your area. That is, you don't know if it's input or output. So that could be an implicit amygdala response, automatic. It knows what the fear faces are and knows what they predict. Or it could be you sitting there talking to yourself. There's a negative one, there's a positive one. And amygdala is reacting to other parts of your cortex having that conversation. So I had to figure out a way to show you fearful facial expressions, and you have no idea that you've seen them. So you've heard of when things are subliminal. You know what I mean by that? There are ways to show you things on a screen and you actually can't see them. You don't report having seen it. And all you do, there's no magic. You throw the fearful face up. You throw it up for 17 milliseconds. That's one refresh rate on a monitor. It's very fast. It's 17 of 1,000 in a second. That's not the magic part. If I just flashed the face for 17 milliseconds, you'd see something. You probably wouldn't be able to tell me it was a afraid face, but you'd probably be able to tell me it was a woman. But I don't want you to see anything. So all you do is, as soon as that flashes for the 17 milliseconds, you then throw up a neutral face of somebody else. So think of that as a film strip. And so she's one frame, and then for like 6 frames would be that the woman with the brown hair. That face would be up there. When those two whip by really quickly, what you tell me you just saw is the brunette. And you cannot see the blonde, okay? And it's not, and we have all males and females, and it's all mixed up, so it's not these people in particular. You just have to use a neutral face of a different person. And what you will tell me you saw. See, now you come out of my scanner, and first of all, you're not running up to me, and nobody's talking to me about emotional expressions, and so I have to ask. So what do you think the study was about? Or describe the faces. And nobody really uses the word neutral, so they say, like, I don't know, they're males and they're females, and the hairdos were kind of dated, and they were grayscale or black and white images. And so what about the expressions on the face? Well, there really weren't any. There was like calm or expressionless. Those would be the words they use. One woman called them vacuous. I looked it up. They are, in fact, vacuous. Okay? Some people just talk like that. But nobody's talking about fearful faces. Nobody's talking about smiles. Nobody's seeing the emotional expressions. And then we go to the next slide, you do the brain analysis, you get the exact same thing. So even though you didn't explicitly see them, amygdala did, okay? So it's very good at what it does for a living. It's very sensitive to these pictures. So if we go to the next picture now, the problem with that, it's wonderful. Subliminal, fearful faces activate the amygdala. You should have seen all the papers that were written when articles covered this study in '98 when I first published it. Everybody wanted to talk about Freud, and that we had found his unconscious. This is not Freud's unconscious, okay? It's an automatic threat detector. That's all it is, and it's very good at what it does. But it's not that good. That is, I have a problem. I already told you amygdala is not that bright, and it isn't. So how the heck could it be discriminating between, that's a lot of complex information on that afraid face. And it's comparing that to a happy face and telling the difference in 17 milliseconds? I don't think so. You go to the next slide, and this is the study we ran. We decided that it's probably using just a part of the face as a proxy for the presence of the whole face. So that's the same picture, we just got rid of everything but the sclera, the whites of the eyes. And again, remember, it's backward mask, so you're not going to see that picture. And that's really important, because that picture's kind of weird, right? You start talking to me about Scooby-Doo closets or something if I ask you what I just showed you. And even though that's a joke, it's actually very important. If amygdala were sending out an alarm call that a fearful expression's out there and bad things happened last time, and your cortex was saying back Scooby-Doo closet, the whole thing might get canceled. So I need this to be subliminal. I need you not to be able to see it. So you can see what this study is. It's just fearful eye whites versus happy eye whites. The last study was fearful faces versus happy faces. I hope you can see what my career's been, the same study over and over and over. Just changing one little thing, though, and you run this study, and on the next slide you see, you get the exact same result. So even when we gave amygdala an entire fearful face, it was just detecting the difference in the size of the sclera on the fear faces versus the neutral or happy faces, okay? So again, it's very good at what it does. It's very sensitive to this. Okay, let's see what we're going to talk about next. So you're not going to be able to see this on these slides, but what we've done in Photoshop here is we have we've changed one feature on her face. Can you see from there what we've done? It's her pupils. It's how dilated her pupils are. And so she's got big pupils on the top one and small pupils on the other one. If you go to the next slide, we wanted to do this just to show. Pupil dilation, if I'm close enough to you to detect a pupil dilation change, that's something my amygdala is going to be very interested in, because pupil dilation is, well, it's a lot like eye widening. It means you've just detected something that you're very interested in. If I'm that close to you, I probably want to figure out what that is. And so amygdala shows you much greater activation to large pupils than it does small pupils. All the pictures in this study were females, and all the subjects were males. We did that on purpose because pupil dilation is also associated with something else. Anybody know? Beauty, attractiveness, how attracted you are. And so what some people have shown in some studies is if you have pictures where the pupils are bigger and smaller in other pictures, people rate people with big pupils as more attractive. You know where that comes from, right? In the Victorian era, women used to put something called belladonna in their eyes, right? It's the same stuff you get at the eye doctor. It dilates your pupils, okay? And so, you know, this is a competition, right? If there's a ball tonight, and I wish to be married by morning, I'm going to win this thing, okay? So I dilate my pupils, I go to the ball. Now, if you've gotten the drops at the eye doctor, you know one other thing happens too. You can't see anything, okay? So if you've seen pictures from the Victorian era, A lot of really pretty girls standing next to some really ugly guys. That's what they get for cheating. Okay. This is just another subtle thing that can happen on a face where if somebody dilated your pupils in front of you, your body would have a reaction to that. Look, when amygdala goes, guess what goes? Your heart rate goes, your respiration goes. Amygdala it's going to start the ball rolling for you. Sometimes you're going to not even realize that you're having an emotional moment and look down and realize you're sweating. Okay, that happens. And this system's set up to kind of just grease the wheels and get all your reflexes ready in case you need them. Things like that. Okay, let's go to the next one after this. So fearful faces are very interesting. And got the widened eyes. He knows something you don't know. That predicted something bad last time I saw it. Surprise faces are maybe even more interesting if you're a psychologist, because you got to ask yourself, is a car coming at her, or did she just walk in on her birthday party? Right? You need not imbue this with positivity or negativity, but we all do. And if I give you 100 of these, males and females, and ask you that question, what's happening to this person? Ask yourself this: how many times are you going to tell me a negative story? Okay? And then my question, once I have those data, is, does that, for me as a psychologist, predict anything useful about you later? Right? So let me show you how we do these. Well, first I'll tell you this. This is what your brain looks like when you're looking at surprise faces. And so there's amygdala activating to somebody with widened eyes who's reacting to something in your immediate environment. Amygdala sends, I think what happens is this: amygdala sends a call to the prefrontal cortex. That person knows something we don't know. Something bad could be happening, could be good, could be bad. Do something, right? It's always asking the cortex to do something because it knows the cortex is smarter. If you look at that face and you tell me you think a car's coming at her, what I see is I see a big signal in the amygdala, and that's it. But if you look at that face and you tell me you think, no, I think she just walked in on her birthday party. I think something positive is happening. I see an activation in the prefrontal cortex in you that I do not see in the pessimist. Okay? So, and I don't know what causes these individual differences yet, but what I think happens is I think amygdala sends the same alarm call in all of us, pessimist or optimist. Prefrontal cortex gets it, makes a decision, either goes with it, and then you tell me the negative story, or reverses it, comes up with some other memory, and then sends a message back to amygdala: calm down, I think this is actually positive. And then you tell me a positive story. So this is regulation, okay? And this is the circuitry you would be using to calm yourself down after you get upset, after you have a fight with a loved one, to keep your anxiety in check when you have an exam the next day. Just breathe deeply and try to calm yourself down from within. It would be the prefrontal cortex coming in and calming areas of the brain like amygdala down, okay? So let's go to the next slide. The way we run these studies is one face comes up at a time. And it's either something that's clearly negative, an angry face, clearly positive, a happy face, or on the next slide, a surprise face. And so you can see, I'll give you two buttons, and you've got to pick, positive or negative. I know which one you're going to push for anger. I know which one you're going to push for happy. My question is, if I do this 100 times, how many times are you going to push the negative button in the case of surprise? So if we go through the next couple of slides, you can see we can just put this on a graph. Percent negative ratings means out of 100 of these, each dot's going to be a person. If you're up high, you're pushing the negative button a lot. And if you're down low, you're pressing the positive button a lot. So for the angry faces, you can see everybody's on top of each other in agreement that the faces are negative. For the happy faces, you can see the same group of people are all in agreement that the happy faces are positive. What did all those people do with the surprise expressions? Just spread yourselves out. Okay? You're going to be variable. So you can see we've got some pessimists up there. And you can see we've got some optimists down here. And then you can see a very interesting group in the middle, like the fence sitters, right? Just 50-50, just knowing it could be either, and just breaking up their responses. This is a relatively new measure for us. As pretty as that graph is, as pretty as those data are, they're not important unless they can predict something else about you. Like, if I give this test to a 14-year-old and then visit them when they're 24 to see who has developed depression or an anxiety disorder, and then go back and see what they said here, because I don't know what the right answer is. Is it necessarily a bad thing to think that things might be negative 70% of the time? Is it necessarily a good thing to be so rosy and think they're positive 90% of the time? Or is it better to be a fence sitter? Be there in the middle where you might be more flexible than the others. And in fact, we have some brand new data on this. Turns out, in one study so far anyway, the answer ends up being you want to be in the middle. So when we measured social anxiety, the people who were high in social anxiety were either the 100%ers or the 10%ers. Get it? It wasn't, even if it was wrong to be rigid. If you were 90% anything, didn't matter whether you were positive or negative. You showed us a high social anxiety score. And if you were a 50%er, being able to flip, maybe being more flexible, you had low social anxiety scale, low scores on a social anxiety scale. So far, that's what we think this measure might mean. Okay, let's keep going, see what we got. This is the same study. Now I'm measuring how long it's taking you to push that button. Okay? So positive or negative, angry face comes up, you can press that button in less than a second. That's easy. Happy face comes up, you press the positive button in less than a second. That's easy. how long does it take you to answer when the surprise faces come up? On the next slide, it takes you longer. That's not surprising, because you have to make a choice here. There's two possibilities. What's interesting, though, is that some of those button presses are positive button presses, and some of them are negative button presses. So on the next slide, let's break those apart. And you can see, and here's the take-home. It takes you the longest to call surprise positive. Do you understand? Optimism takes more effort. It takes more work. You've got to work at it a little bit longer. How much longer? 300 milliseconds. You got that. Okay? And what's happening is, remember the blue area of the prefrontal cortex? Amygdala's got to send its alarm call. That area has to come online. It's got to get all the way back, calm it down. That's going to take a little bit longer. And that circuitry needs to be practiced. It needs to be used. And what we're doing with you when we do cognitive behavioral therapy is we're teaching you how to recruit your prefrontal cortex and how to use that circuitry more. Because if you don't use it, it's not going to be a helpful circuit for you. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. Okay, let's see where we're going now. So first, we're just going to talk about being anxious. You and me. Well, me. I don't know about you. About normal levels of anxiety. See, that's the beauty of, that's why I study anxiety. Because you all know what I'm talking about. As interesting as it is to talk about schizophrenia, you're not going to really be able to relate when we talk about somebody who thinks someone's put a chip in their head and is controlling their thoughts right now. That's interesting, but not something we can really relate to. Anxiety, I think we all know what we're talking about, right? In fact, when I teach this stuff to college kids, I have to be really careful because I can see them diagnosing themselves on a moment-to-moment basis as we talk, right? Very difficult to get through a lecture on obsessive-compulsive disorder without the whole room doing this, Because we all do that. Everybody has little quirky things they do. So I tell them, so I try to share. I say, so, ready? I got a thing. Ready? Here's my thing. In the morning, when I'm just getting the shower ready, I'm just trying to feel the temperature of the water to make sure it's not too hot. And this hand's wet. Guess what this hand says? I want to get wet too. It's like, okay, you can get wet too. Okay? It's a little weird, people. Okay? I have a symmetry thing. Once this hand gets wet, this one has to get wet. Now, I only do it once, and I do it every morning, but just once. And I go to work. See? So I don't have obsessive-compulsive disorder, because if I did, I'd stand there and go, well, now this one's not as wet, right? And I'd be 45 minutes late for work. That's obsessive-compulsive disorder. It's when these little things we all do come in and they start functionally impairing your life, and you're not making it to work, right? So all of us have had the moment where we parked the car in the garage, and we got to the elevator, and we're like, did I lock the doors? And I can't really remember if I heard the beep. And actually, I can remember a beep. I just don't know if it's today's beep or yesterday's beep, right? So I got to walk back to the car, hear the beep, and then some of us, we need to hear it again. Boop. And get on with my day, right? So we all do that. But if you are now walking back to the car for the 9th time, you just can't convince yourself that you heard it. You're 15 minutes late for work. This is the 3rd time this has happened this week, and you've been warned about this. That's when the little quirky things we do are beginning to take over your life. Okay, so that's the difference. So if we go to the next slide, You now know the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex are connected. There must be a path there. There is. It's a nice fiber tract called the uncinate fasciculus. I just like to say that. It's not orange. It doesn't have arrows. It's actually white because it's a myelinated pathway. But it has a thickness, and we can measure it. So we can measure how thick your connection is between your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala. And to horrifically oversimplify it for you, if we go to the next slide, if I give you a trait anxiety scale, it's called the Spielberger, 20 items, which basically you're answering questions about how jumpy you tend to be on a daily basis. Okay? If I give you that scale and then measure your pathway, what I find is people who score low on a trait anxiety scale have a thicker connection between their amygdala and their prefrontal cortex. And conversely, if we go to the next slide and the one after it, the people who score high on this, they have a very thin pathway. Okay? The actual hardware is different, right? So it raises immediately a very interesting chicken and egg question. Did we all come into the world with different size pathways? And is that part of the explanation for the individual differences we show in being calm and being jumpy? Or did we all come into the world with the exact same size pathway, and then stuff happened to us? And some of us experienced traumas, and our pathways thinned out. And some of us were taught how to regulate and practice regulating, and our pathways thickened up. Okay? So there's lots of ways to try to get at that. What we're doing is we're having these same kids come back once a week for a year. And we're going to do something with them. We're going to do some cognitive behavioral therapy. We're going to let them listen to some music that they tell us they find soothing. We're going to teach them how to meditate. And what we're hoping to do is thicken up some pathways, show that within a year we can actually thicken the actual structure with those sorts of experiences. So that's happening right now. I don't have an answer for you yet, sorry. It's possible it won't budge, though. It's possible that this is what you come to the world with, and you can't really move the structure around. You can train people to use what they have to the best of their ability, but you really can't change the actual structure. So that's a possibility, too. I don't know the answer to that yet. How are we doing on time? So let me maybe tell you one more. I'll think of one more thing to tell you, and then I know we have some kids here from the high school, and you don't get your extra credit unless I leave times for questions, so I'll try to do that. So what do we got next here? Oh yeah. Well, we're in Vermont. If you think about that pathway I just taught you about, what brain damage patient is the most relevant to that pathway? Who's that? Yeah. So anybody know his name? The guy who had a railroad, had a tamping iron go right through his head. So yeah, that's Phineas Gage. Yeah. So if you go to the next picture, so that's what Phineas looks like after the accident. He survived. This thing entered right behind his left eye and went straight out the top of his head. A 3.5-foot iron rod. It happened in Cavendish. If you drive to Cavendish, if you go skiing at Okemo, you drive right by the accident site and the plaque that's out there. What happened to Phineas is he was the foreman of the railroad and a very responsible and respected guy, and this thing went through his head and he lived physically, but his behavior changed quite dramatically. And if you think about that orange connection, what happened is initially we would have interpreted it as, oh, whatever tissue he damaged there is the issue. But I think the bigger issue with Phineas is what that iron probably did is it probably cut that cable. So now you have an amygdala that can go and a prefrontal cortex that isn't connected to it to control it. And so he had fits of rage, and he started to swear a lot, and he never swore before. His behavior was just unregulated, basically. So he was unable for his prefrontal cortex to be able to weigh in. Okay, can I see the next slide? So here you go. These spaces are so simple, and we can get so much out of them. Here we just took a bunch of patients who have post-traumatic stress disorder. These are all war veterans. And all we did was show fearful faces on the screen. And yep, amygdala activated to them, and yes, as a group, their amygdala activation was much higher than comparing them to a control group. But what also happens, I didn't really show you this, but when your amygdala activates the fear faces, the prefrontal cortex comes on too, to kind of like control it, right? It is just a picture. You are in an experiment. It's not a real situation. It's not 2 in the morning and you're not in a dark alley. If you were, the fear face would mean something different. So you'd have prefrontal coming in, probably putting on the brakes. So you should have some level of prefrontal activation to a fearful face. What you're seeing here is in that area where normal subjects activate the prefrontal cortex to fearful faces. As a group, all these folks have post-traumatic stress disorder. Every dot there's a person. And what's on the scale there on the bottom is their symptom severity. So anybody who's over to the right is a very sick person. And anybody who's over on the left also has PTSD, but their symptoms aren't as severe. They don't have as many symptoms. And you can see that what's on the y-axis here is how much they're able to activate the prefrontal cortex. So there's differences here. So the point is, as a group, they activate prefrontal lower than you. But within the group, if they can just get a little, they're less sick. If they can just turn their prefrontal cortex on a little, they can't turn it on as much as you can. But if they can just get any of it, it exquisitely, almost perfectly predicts how severe their symptoms are. So where the folks on the right there, they're not activating it at all, and they're our sickest patients. Okay? So this is the emotion regulation circuitry. And so from there, I think, can we just go ahead until you see the two little boys? Okay. When I present a face to you, the first thing you do is you look at the eyes. That's what a normal brain does. It knows that the eye region of the face is a very, very important place to discern information about how someone else is feeling. When you have autism, you don't do this very well. So those are my nephews. That's Christopher on the left, and that's Cameron on the right. They're twins. Christopher does not have autism. Cameron has autism. And he has a terrible, he's 7 now. He's much better. He would not engage with eye. He wouldn't engage in direct eye contact. They do something we just call gaze aversion. They just look down. They pretty much just look here. And so what we did with Cam, well, my sister actually came up with this idea. So if you just go through the pictures, Cam likes to, he likes the color name. So we thought, okay, well, if you want to play the color naming game, well, here's what you're going to have to do. Sure, you can tell me the fire hydrant is yellow, and on the next slide you can tell me the cab is yellow, and on this slide you can tell me the girl's coat is red. Notice there's people now, but they're facing away. On the next slide you could maybe tell me the sign in the back is red. There's people, they're facing towards Cam now, but they're not looking at him. And then as we go further and further with the game, here we would have him name her hair color and name her shirt color. Eventually, I hope you can see where we're going here, he's going to have to name the color of her eyes. And if he wants to play the coloring game, he's going to have to look at the eyes. And we can have him do so many of these pictures and build them up until he gets more comfortable doing this. The reason we're doing this, and we think it's going to work, I can tell you anecdotally, it seemed to help Cameron, but I haven't run a study yet where I'm not related to the people involved, right? So on the next slide, we're going to show you fear faces, and we're going to tell you to either tell us the expression, fear or neutral, tell us the gender, male or female, or tell us the eye color, okay? And we'll have the pictures so they'll have all different eyes. So you're always seeing fearful and neutral faces, but you're doing one of 3 tasks, okay? Or you're going to do all of them, actually. And I'll show you the data now. On the left there, that's a greater amygdala response to fear greater than neutral to expression. All the way to the right, that's a greater amygdala response to fear. So we already knew that. But look what happens when I tell you just to name the color of the eyes. You don't get an amygdala activation. Okay? So what we think is we've stumbled onto something so simple that where Cam's going to be calmer just doing something simple like naming eye color for reasons that I'm not going to pretend to know. It must have something to do with if I make you look at the important part of the face for emotion, but have you do something that has nothing to do with emotion. The word we use for that is orthogonal. We just like big words like that. The task is orthogonal to emotion. It has nothing to do with it. And for some reason, that calms amygdala down. Okay? So this we're working on right now. That is not subjects with autism. That's 20-year-olds on a college campus. But we think that we're onto something with this very simple little task. And so I think with that, I'll stop. What's the next slide? And then the next? Yeah, I'll stop there. Okay. So, questions? And should we start with the high school kids? If you guys are being serious with me about this whole extra credit thing? Or was I being fibbed to? Or you just don't really care about the credit that much? Or anybody can ask a question. Well, I think meditation and anything that is trying to teach you to be calm while there's also some imposed physical tension on purpose, like yoga is the perfect example, where you're tensing your body, but we're trying to get you to calm yourself from within at the same time. I think anything like that is going to help anyone. Is it going to fix PTSD? No. Will it help them handle and function a little bit better? Maybe. The reason I'm him and han here is PTSD is the most severe of all the things, all the anxiety disorders. So I can take somebody with GAD and get great success using things like meditation. And with someone with PTSD, you know, we can get relief. They can, you know, they may find they're handling things better on a daily basis, but certainly not. You're not going to get the kind of impact you're going to get like in somebody with a less severe anxiety disorder. Because that's the problem with PTSD is comorbidity. That is, it comes with a lot of other baggage. I have yet to meet someone with post-traumatic stress disorder who does not also have major depression and a pretty healthy substance abuse problem. So you throw all those things on, and then it becomes very difficult to deal with. I'd say that this information is, and the question was, when you think about prefrontal amygdala and those connections, if that's really what regulation is all about, the question was, how does that differ in adolescence compared to the adult brain? And this is the work of someone named B.J. Casey, and she's at Cornell. And that circuitry is still myelinating up until you're 25, and and 15 to 25 is the big time. And so you take that, and then you realize when you're looking at an 11-year-old, they really don't have the hardware yet, and that's why you supervise them, because they're not going to be able to regulate. They won't have the thing hooked up as well yet. And it's hooking up and strengthening until you're 25, and then what we want to know is can you keep going? Can you keep working on this and get it even stronger? So this question was how does anti-anxiety medication work? And instead of sitting here and explaining what's going to happen at the synapse, but really they're targeting specific transmitters. So there's ones that go after norepinephrine, there's ones that go after dopamine, and there's the most common ones are the ones that try to increase how well you can use serotonin. But their real role is to get you back on the playing field. So you can do the drugs by themselves if you want, and you can do the CBT by itself if you want. But the best thing is we have the drugs so you'll get out of bed and make it to your appointment and feel a little bit, have a little more energy. And then once you're there, then you want to start doing the CBT and practice, using your prefrontal cortex to regulate. And then the goal would be that over time you could maybe titrate yourself off the drug, right? So it treats the symptoms and not it is just a patch. So that's why you have to do the talk therapy, because you've got to work on gaining a skill set that you're going to go to the next time you get stressed. Because the drugs, they aren't going to change anything in the brain. They're just going to increase your mood, make you feel a little better. And that's really their only role. So the question was, years ago, this woman had been taught that traumatic things that happen get lodged in the amygdala, get sunk in there. They stay there, and they're harder to access there. And that doesn't really seem consistent with the way I'm thinking about things. And it's similar to 10 years ago, you had been told the amygdala is the fear center of your brain. It is the source of your feeling of fear. It's not. It has nothing to do with that. It can call for fear, which is a very complex emotion and would be a whole network of brain areas that are responsible for you feeling afraid. It's really just telling the rest of the brain, this is a good time to learn. Last time we saw this, bad things happened. That's really all it does, is makes the rest of the brain do whatever it does better. It's going to make you see better. It's going to make you hear. You might hear something you wouldn't have heard a second ago. It makes you more vigilant. As for accessing traumas, you don't need amygdala for that story. It's certainly possible, if wherever memories get laid down, that things can be so traumatic, they are more difficult to access. But I wouldn't think of that as a purely amygdala thing. No, it's not. It's the same thing. So remember that the sclera stuff, that was all subliminal. So you didn't know you were seeing them, right? that we get our biggest, this might seem counterintuitive to you, we get a bigger amygdala activation in a backward masking paradigm than we do if you were looking at the faces. Because you don't get any crosstalk. If you're in my experiment, you're sitting there going, there's a face, there's a face, you say, I got an appointment in 15 minutes, another face, and you can create more noise in your head, more crosstalk. And so you kind of erase all that. So I think what's happening is just by having them focus on eye color, because if you didn't have Cam focusing on eye color, he'd be thinking about like how he thinks that person is threatening or something. And it allows him to set those things aside, I think, and keeps this system down. What you might have noticed is when we had them do gender, that was our biggest effect. And when we had them name the fearful expression, it was there, but it was smaller. See, the closer we get you to emotion, the more amygdala is going to get tamped down. But if we can let you just think of other things like male or female, this system can get bigger, right? So I think they're all very similar in that respect. Yeah, they don't unless we want them to. So we screen for everything. So anybody who's ever been in my study, either they're there because they have a disorder, in which case I have to screen out all the other disorders, or, God forbid, one of us be walking around the world with an anxiety disorder and not know it. People volunteer, and then we say, we're going to refer you to somebody else because you look like you're dealing with something here. So we try to carefully screen for those things, but that's the beauty of, that's the best and worst thing about studying human beings. We're very poisoned, so it's tougher to exactly know that we've gotten it all. And people lie to scales. They just don't tell you, have you had more than 5 drinks in any one time this week? No, not me. You're 20 years old, you're in college, and your eyes look like road maps. Do you want to answer the question again? So we're exploring that question right now. We're looking at it from we're going to do cognitive behavioral therapy once a week with people, which basically is an hour a week where they're really practicing thinking about the way they talk to themselves when stressful things happen. And we're going to see if we can affect some change in the actual structure, which, if we did, would be consistent with what you're thinking. That's what might get you a thick cable versus a thin cable. I can tell you that there's a woman named Nim Tottenham at UCLA, and she's studying children who were raised in an orphanage. So she's studying them at the age of 15, but they were in an orphanage for the first 6 years of their life. So they're people who were adopted to the United States. And she's seeing all kinds of structural differences in that cable, in the amygdala. And so it really looks like that nurture is going to be a big part of this story. For the structure, which is, scary. But that also means you can change it back, right? We really help the person who gets a diagnosis of depression when we say to them, by the way, we know this is a brain thing now, because it allows them to alleviate themselves of some guilt, and they can get to work. But the flip side, the problem with that is if they don't understand what I mean when I say a brain thing, if they think, oh, well then I'm locked in, like there's nothing, I can't change this if it's the brain. No, you can. I can give you experiences and change the structure of your brain. That's how your brain got there. It's the only way you're going to get it back. And so you have to believe that you can, with experience, you can change the brain, both the chemistry and the actual structure, the connections. Talking about how severe things are with someone with PTSD, is there any hope that meditation or doing these, or CBT over time could actually change their cables and their structure? And the answer is yes. And then the second question is, well, when are you going to do that? And the answer is now. But so I do all my work with normals, with kids who volunteer from a flyer who are available at 4:30 on a Tuesday. You know what I mean? And I do all my patient work collaboratively so all the PTSD stuff I do with a woman named Lisa Shin at Mass General, and all the generalized anxiety disorder stuff I do with a guy named Ed Kalin. So we're working on it, and this is relatively new stuff, and it's going to be a while. But that we're running all these studies and measuring these cables. If my father had post-traumatic stress disorder, I would make sure he's talking to somebody once a week, and I would have him make sure he would volunteer for these research studies. They're probably not going to change his life, but they could, just showing up and doing things like that can be very therapeutic in and of itself, first of all.
Especially when they believe that this is not fixable.
Right, yeah. No, I think But that's what I would do. I'd make sure that somebody at Mass General saw him and evaluated him, because that's the best place in the world that's doing that type of work. Yeah. So the question is, okay, got it. Cable size is important. What about what actually goes on right at that site of the prefrontal cortex that you need to be able to regulate the amygdala? And that's kind of related to the million-dollar question. Is an anxiety disorder an amygdala that continues to intrude on the rest of the brain so you can't get your work done? Or is it a prefrontal cortex that's unable to regulate? And the answer is both. You can get there either way. PTSD looks like it's both. They clearly have an exaggerated amygdala response. We know this because in backward masking studies, even when they don't know they're there, their responses are through the roof. Whereas you compare them to someone with OCD, and you don't see that in the amygdala to backward masked fear faces. So they don't have a basic elementary amygdala problem. But you show them the overt faces that they can see. And PTSD and OCD look exactly the same, because in OCD it's what you're saying to yourself when you're getting stressed. And that's what's getting you into trouble. And then what that does is grabs amygdala and drags it in. So there's two ways to get anxious, and one is for the cortex to talk amygdala into anxiety, and the other way is for amygdala to be so responsive to these things like eye whites that it sets the brain off. But the answer to your question is, I don't know, meaning there's a circuitry there at the end of that cable that's better at this. It's recruitable. It probably talks to a bigger network of other brain areas when it gets going. And like it was said in the balcony, it was probably trained up that way. This person either trained themselves or was trained by someone else on very simple regulation strategies that the key is to, what you try to do with any sort of therapy is just like driving your car. The thing that you have to work at, you're trying to make it your automatic response. You're trying to make regulation implicit. And so when you get that circuitry really, really good at that, you have to start explicitly, but your whole goal is to have that thing come online automatically without you even having to think about it, right? Yeah, I think if you could imagine a day where you can imagine what might be happening when you have somebody who's taking SSRIs and doing talk therapy, is that the SSRIs might have a bigger impact on just keeping amygdala calm. And then with the talk therapy, you're working on the prefrontal connectivity. So yeah, they're both important, and even with as much as we know, you can see we can point to the two areas and we know they're connected, but we don't know a lot about why and how they got there and how we're going to move it around. But we at least feel like now we know where to look for a while, that this is an important circuit. The questions were, are there gender differences? And there are gender differences in emotional disorders. We know that, right? So depression is represented in women greater than it is in men, but that might be a reporting error. That is, it might be that men aren't seeking help and being diagnosed where women are more likely to do so. I see no differences in anything I've studied yet. So in this basic facial expression processing stuff, there's no gender differences in my work. No gender differences in the cable yet. But I would expect there to be in the disorders when I get there, but we haven't done, we're doing those studies now. And as for aging, yeah, that goes both ways. Some people get really happy when they get older too. And then other people suddenly find themselves dealing with anxiety that they've never had to deal with their whole life. And yeah, you'd want to know, did something change in that circuitry? But so that's a really good question, but nothing I've looked at yet. So the question was, when we were talking about that graph, the number of times you're going to hit percent negative ratings. And I was telling you I didn't know what the right answer was. I didn't know if it was a bad thing to say negative 90% of the time. I didn't know if it was necessarily a good thing to say positive 90% of the time. All I know is I presented the graph to you like a column, but when we studied social anxiety, it became a U, where if you were high negative or high positive, you scored highest on the social anxiety scale. And if you were a 50%er, you scored lowest on the social anxiety scale. So it does seem counterintuitive. The person who's so rosy and optimistic, and why are they dealing with social anxiety? But the answer must be something like, doesn't matter if it's bad or good, it's always bad to be rigid. You know, the fact that it has to be one or the other for these people is probably not a great thing. What it means then is that when they approach their lives, when things happen, they probably are very sure about what just happened, why it's happening to them, why they deserve it, why it's never going to change. Do you see what I'm saying? Rigidity is very dangerous. And if you are the type of person who needs that, that's a risk factor. It doesn't mean it's going to cause anxiety. It doesn't mean it's going to cause depression. It means you are making things harder on yourself, right? Yeah, well, so what's happening is when they ask him to smile, so he's asking about the fellow who had facial paralysis and who can't move the left side of his face, but those muscles can move when he's laughing. And the answer is then that there have to be neurons here that go to those muscles, and they're the ones that are activated when you ask me to try to smile. But there are neurons in the striatum that go to these muscles, and humor activates them. Right? Right, or surprise, or whatever it is. You know, something's getting some verbal, language-based translation of the joke is being passed to the striatum, which can get to these muscles. But when I ask you to move, you don't. That system can't access the striatum apparently. So it's amazing, I think. So you have two brains. You have an automatic brain, and you have a voluntary brain. And now you know it's also true for your emotional life, that this stuff starts without you. It's going on all the time. Maybe it's working right now. The background masking is kind of contrived and made up, right? You don't ever see that. But what does happen is you have a lot of visual information, and you can't pay attention to all of it. And what those data tell you is if it hits your retina, it's in there. And you're going to have reactions to things that you may not be aware are in your environment. But this system will. It's cool. It means you can forgive yourself your reactions in the first half second. You have an automatic reactivity, and then you regulate. So if you go to the Dartmouth website, it'll be easy enough to find me in the psychology department. You email me, I'll be happy to suggest things. The first one I'll suggest is my own book, but it's not done yet. You know, human amygdala, that's a scientific monograph. It's boring. And I didn't write it, I edited it, meaning it's just a bunch of chapters from a bunch of scientists, and I helped put it all together. I'm writing a book right now called The Uncertainty of It All, which is all about this stuff. I'm on sabbatical, and I hope to have it done by the end of the year. So I'll be happy to sell you that one when it's ready. Yeah. Thank you, this has been fun.